A cruiser is a type of warship. The term has been in use for several hundred years, and has had different meanings throughout this period. During the Age of Sail, the term cruising referred to certain kinds of missions: independent scouting, commerce protection, or raiding fulfilled by a frigate or sloop, which were the cruising warships of a fleet. Modern cruisers are generally the largest ships in a fleet after aircraft carriers, and can usually perform several roles. In the middle of the 19th century, cruiser came to be a classification for the ships intended for cruising distant waters, commerce raiding, and scouting for the battle fleet. Cruisers came in a wide variety of sizes, from the medium-sized protected cruiser to large armored cruisers that were nearly as big, although not as powerful or as well armored, as a pre-Dreadnought battleship. With the advent of the Dreadnought battleship before World War I, the armored cruiser evolved into a vessel of similar scale known as the battlecruiser. The very large battlecruisers of the World War I era that succeeded armored cruisers were now classified, along with Dreadnought battleships, as capital ships. By the early 20th century after World War I, the direct successors to protected cruisers could be placed on a consistent scale of warship size, smaller than a battleship but larger than a destroyer. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty placed a formal limit on these cruisers, which were defined as warships of up to 10,000 tons displacement carrying guns no larger than 8 inches in caliber. Heavy cruisers had 8-inch guns, while those with guns of 6.1 inches or less were light cruisers, which shaped cruiser design until the end of World War II. Some variations on the treaty cruiser design included the German Deutschland class pocket battleships, which had heavier armament at the expense of speed compared to standard heavy cruisers, and the American Alaska class, which was a scaled-up heavy cruiser design designated as a cruiser killer. In the later 20th century, the obsolescence of the battleship left the cruiser as the largest and most powerful surface combatant after the aircraft carrier. The role of the cruiser varied according to ship and navy, often including air defense and shore bombardment. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy's cruisers had heavy anti-ship missile armament designed to sink NATO carrier task forces via saturation attack. The U.S. Navy built guided missile cruisers upon destroyer-style hulls, some called destroyer leaders or frigates prior to the 1975 reclassification, primarily designed to provide air defense while often adding anti-submarine capabilities, being larger and having longer-range surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, than early Charles F. Adams guided missile destroyers tasked with the short-range air defense role. By the end of the Cold War, the line between cruisers and destroyers had blurred, with the Ticonderoga-class cruiser using the hull of the Spruance-class destroyer but receiving the cruiser designation due to their enhanced mission and combat systems. Indeed, the newest U.S. Navy destroyers, for instance the Arleigh Burke-class and Zumwalt-class, are more heavily armed than some of the cruisers that they succeeded. Currently only 2 nations operate cruisers, the United States and Russia. BAP Almirante Grau was still in service with the Peruvian Navy until 2017, and was the last gun cruiser in service in any navy. Early history. The term cruiser or cruiser was first commonly used in the 17th century to refer to an independent warship. Cruiser meant the purpose or mission of a ship, rather than a category of vessel. However, the term was nonetheless used to mean a smaller, faster warship suitable for such a role. In the 17th century, the ship of the line was generally too large, inflexible, and expensive to be dispatched on long-range missions, for instance, to the Americas, and too strategically important to be put at risk of fouling and foundering by continual patrol duties. The Dutch Navy was noted for its cruisers in the 17th century, while the Royal Navy and later French and Spanish navies subsequently caught up in terms of their numbers and deployment. The British Cruiser and Convoy Acts were an attempt by mercantile interests in Parliament to focus the Navy on commerce defence and raiding with cruisers, rather than the more scarce and expensive ships of the line. During the 18th century the frigate became the preeminent type of cruiser. A frigate was a small, fast, long-range, lightly armed, single-gun deck, ship used for scouting, carrying dispatches, and disrupting enemy trade. The other principal type of cruiser was the sloop, but many other miscellaneous types of ship were used as well. Steam cruisers. During the 19th century, navies began to use steam power for their fleets. The 1840s saw the construction of experimental steam-powered frigates and sloops. By the middle of the 1850s, the British and U.S. navies were both building steam frigates with very long hulls and a heavy gun armament, for instance USS Merrimack or Mersey. The 1860s saw the introduction of the ironclad. The first ironclads were frigates, in the sense of having one gun deck, however, they were also clearly the most powerful ships in the Navy, and were principally to serve in the line of battle. In spite of their great speed, they would have been wasted in a cruising role. The French constructed a number of smaller ironclads for overseas cruising duties, starting with the Bellecourtis, commissioned 1865. These station ironclads were the beginning of the development of the armored cruisers, a type of ironclad specifically for the traditional cruiser missions of fast, independent raiding and patrol. The first true armored cruiser was the Russian General Admiral, completed in 1874, and followed by the British Shannon a few years later. Until the 1890s, armored cruisers were still built with masts for a full sailing rig, to enable them to operate far from friendly coaling stations. Unarmored cruising warships, built out of wood, iron, steel, or a combination of those materials, remained popular until towards the end of the 19th century. The ironclad's armor often meant that they were limited to short range under steam, and many ironclads were unsuited to long-range missions or for work in distant colonies. The unarmored cruiser, often a screw sloop or screw frigate, could continue in this role. Even though mid or late 19th century cruisers typically carried up-to-date guns firing explosive shells, they were unable to face ironclads in combat. This was evidenced by the clash between HMS Shah, a modern British cruiser, and the Peruvian monitor Huáscar. Even though the Peruvian vessel was obsolescent by the time of the encounter, it stood up well to roughly 50 hits from British shells. Steel cruisers. In the 1880s, naval engineers began to use steel as a material for construction and armament. A steel cruiser could be lighter and faster than one built of iron or wood. The Jean Nicole school of naval doctrine suggested that a fleet of fast unprotected steel cruisers were ideal for commerce raiding, while the torpedo boat would be able to destroy an enemy battleship fleet. Steel also offered the cruiser a way of acquiring the protection needed to survive in combat. Steel armor was considerably stronger, for the same weight, than iron. By putting a relatively thin layer of steel armor above the vital parts of the ship, and by placing the coal bunkers where they might stop shell fire, a useful degree of protection could be achieved without slowing the ship too much. Protected cruisers generally had an armored deck with sloped sides, providing similar protection to a light armored belt at less weight and expense. The first protected cruiser was the Chilean ship Esmeralda, launched in 1883. Produced by a shipyard at Elswick, in Britain, owned by Armstrong, she inspired a group of protected cruisers produced in the same yard and known as the Elswick Cruisers. Her forecastle, poop deck, and the wooden board deck had been removed, replaced with an armored deck. Esmeralda's armament consisted of fore and aft 10-inch, 25.4 cm, guns and 6-inch, 15.2 cm, guns in the midships positions. It could reach a speed of 18 knots, 33 km per hour, and was propelled by steam alone. It also had a displacement of less than 3,000 tons. During the two following decades, this cruiser type came to be the inspiration for combining heavy artillery, high speed, and low displacement. Torpedo cruisers. The torpedo cruiser, known in the Royal Navy as the torpedo gunboat, was a smaller unarmored cruiser, which emerged in the 1880s to 1890s. These ships could reach speeds up to 20 knots, 37 km per hour, and were armed with medium to small caliber guns as well as torpedoes. These ships were tasked with guard and reconnaissance duties, to repeat signals and all other fleet duties for which smaller vessels were suited. These ships could also function as flagships of torpedo boat flotillas. After the 1900s, these ships were usually traded for faster ships with better sea-going qualities. Pre-Dreadnought armored cruisers. Steel also affected the construction and role of armored cruisers. Steel meant that new designs of battleship, later known as pre-dreadnought battleships, would be able to combine firepower and armor with better endurance and speed than ever before. The armored cruisers of the 1890s greatly resembled the battleships of the day. They tended to carry slightly smaller main armament, 9.2-inch, 230 mm, rather than 12-inch, and have somewhat thinner armor in exchange for a faster speed, perhaps 21 knots, 39 km per hour, rather than 18. Because of their similarity, the lines between battleships and armored cruisers became blurred. Early 20th century. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century there were difficult questions about the design of future cruisers. Modern armored cruisers, almost as powerful as battleships, were also fast enough to outrun older protected and unarmored cruisers. In the Royal Navy, Jackie Fisher cut back hugely on older vessels, including many cruisers of different sorts, calling them a miser's hoard of useless junk that any modern cruiser would sweep from the seas. The scout cruiser also appeared in this era. This was a small, fast, lightly armed and armored type designed primarily for reconnaissance. The Royal Navy and the Italian Navy were the primary developers of this type. Battle cruisers. The growing size and power of the armored cruiser resulted in the battlecruiser, with an armament and size similar to the revolutionary new dreadnought battleship, the brainchild of British Admiral Jackie Fisher. He believed that to ensure British naval dominance in its overseas colonial possessions, a fleet of large, fast, powerfully armed vessels which would be able to hunt down and mop up enemy cruisers and armored cruisers with overwhelming fire superiority was needed. This type of vessel came to be known as the battlecruiser, and the first were commissioned into the Royal Navy in 1907. The British battlecruisers sacrificed protection for speed, and this became tragic with the loss of 3 of them at the Battle of Jutland. Germany and eventually Japan followed suit to build these vessels, replacing armored cruisers in most frontline roles. Battlecruisers were in many cases larger and more expensive than contemporary battleships, due to their much larger propulsion plants. Light cruisers. At around the same time as the battlecruiser was developed, the distinction between the armored and the unarmored cruiser finally disappeared. By the British Town class, the first of which was launched in 1909, it was possible for a small, fast cruiser to carry both belt and deck armor, particularly when turbine engines were adopted. These light armored cruisers began to occupy the traditional cruiser role once it became clear that the battlecruiser squadrons were required to operate with the battle fleet. Flotilla leaders. Some light cruisers were built specifically to act as the leaders of flotillas of destroyers. Coast Guard cruisers. These vessels were essentially large coastal patrol boats armed with multiple light guns. One such warship was Grivia of the Romanian Navy. She displaced 110 tons, measured 60 meters in length and was armed with 4 light guns. Auxiliary cruisers. Auxiliary cruiser was a merchant ship hastily armed with small guns on the outbreak of war. Auxiliary cruisers were used to fill gaps in their long-range lines or provide escort for other cargo ships, although they generally proved to be useless in this role because of their low speed, feeble firepower, and lack of armor. In both world wars the Germans also used small merchant ships armed with cruiser guns to surprise Allied merchant ships. Some large liners were armed in the same way. In British service these were known as armed merchant cruisers, AMC. The Germans and French used them in World War I as raiders because of their high speed, around 30 knots, 56 km per hour, and they were used again as raiders early in World War II by the Germans and Japanese. In both the First World War and in the early part of the Second, they were used as convoy escorts by the British. World War I. Cruisers were one of the workhorse types of warship during World War I. Mid-20th century. Naval construction in the 1920s and 1930s was limited by international treaties designed to prevent the repetition of the dreadnought arms race of the early 20th century. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 placed limits on the construction of ships with a standard displacement of more than 10,000 tons and an armament of guns larger than 8-inch, 203 mm. A number of navies commissioned classes of cruisers at the top end of this limit, known as treaty cruisers. The London Naval Treaty in 1930 then formalized the distinction between these heavy cruisers and light cruisers. A heavy cruiser was one with guns of more than 6.1 inch, 155 mm, caliber. The Second London Naval Treaty attempted to reduce the tonnage of new cruisers to 8,000 or less, but this had little effect. Japan and Germany were not signatories, and some navies had already begun to evade treaty limitations on warships. The First London Treaty did touch off a period of the major powers building 6-inch or 6.1-inch gunned cruisers, nominally of 10,000 tons and with up to 15 guns, the treaty limit. Thus, most light cruisers ordered after 1930 were the size of heavy cruisers but with more and smaller guns. The Imperial Japanese Navy began this new race with the Megami Class, launched in 1934. After building smaller light cruisers with 6 or 8 6-inch guns launched 1931–35, the British Royal Navy followed with the 12-gun Southampton class in 1936. To match foreign developments and potential treaty violations, in the 1930s the U.S. developed a series of new guns firing super-heavy armor-piercing ammunition. These included the 6-inch, 152 mm, /47 caliber gun Mark 16 introduced with the 15-gun Brooklyn-class cruisers in 1936, and the 8-inch, 203 mm, /55 caliber gun Mark 12 introduced with USS Wichita, CA-45, in 1937. Heavy cruisers. The heavy cruiser was a type of cruiser designed for long range, high speed, and an armament of naval guns around 203 mm, 8 in caliber. The first heavy cruisers were built in 1915, although it only became a widespread classification following the London Naval Treaty in 1930. The heavy cruisers' immediate precursors were the light cruiser designs of the 1910s and 1920s. The U.S. lightly armored 8-inch treaty cruisers of the 1920s, built under the Washington Naval Treaty, were originally classed as light cruisers until the London Treaty forced their redesignation. Initially, all cruisers built under the Washington Treaty had torpedo tubes, regardless of nationality. However, in 1930, results of war games caused the U.S. Naval War College to conclude that only perhaps half of cruisers would use their torpedoes in action. In a surface engagement, long-range gunfire and destroyer torpedoes would decide the issue, and under air attack numerous cruisers would be lost before getting within torpedo range. Thus, beginning with USS New Orleans, CA-32, launched in 1933, new cruisers were built without torpedoes, and torpedoes were removed from older heavy cruisers due to the perceived hazard of their being exploded by shell fire. The Japanese took exactly the opposite approach with cruiser torpedoes, and this proved crucial to their tactical victories in most of the numerous cruiser actions of 1942. Beginning with the Furitaka class launched in 1925, every Japanese heavy cruiser was armed with 24-inch, 610 mm, torpedoes, larger than any other cruisers. By 1933 Japan had developed the Type 93 torpedo for these ships, eventually nicknamed Long Lance by the Allies. This type used compressed oxygen instead of compressed air, allowing it to achieve ranges and speeds unmatched by other torpedoes. It could achieve a range of 22,000 meters, 24,000 yd, at 50 knots, 93 km per hour, 58 miles per hour, compared with the U.S. Mark 15 torpedo with 5,500 meters, 6,000 yd, at 45 knots, 83 km per hour, 52 miles per hour. The Mark 15 had a maximum range of 13,500 meters, 14,800 yd, at 26.5 knots, 49.1 km per hour, 30.5 miles per hour, still well below the Long Lance. The Japanese were able to keep the Type 93's performance and oxygen power secret until the Allies recovered one in early 1943, thus the Allies faced a great threat they were not aware of in 1942. The Type 93 was also fitted to post-1930 Japanese light cruisers and the majority of their World War II destroyers. Heavy cruisers continued in use until after World War II, with some converted to guided missile cruisers for air defense or strategic attack and some used for shore bombardment by the United States in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. German pocket battleships. The German Deutschland class was a series of 3 Panzerschiff, armored ships, a form of heavily armed cruiser, designed and built by the German Reichsmarine in nominal accordance with restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. All 3 ships were launched between 1931 and 1934, and served with Germany's Kriegsmarine during World War II. Within the Kriegsmarine, the Panzerschiff had the propaganda value of capital ships, heavy cruisers with battleship guns, torpedoes, and scout aircraft. The similar Swedish Panzerschiff were tactically used as centers of battle fleets and not as cruisers. They were deployed by Nazi Germany in support of the German interests in the Spanish Civil War. Panzerschiff Admiral Graf Spee represented Germany in the 1937 Coronation Fleet Review. The British press referred to the vessels as pocket battleships, in reference to the heavy firepower contained in the relatively small vessels. They were considerably smaller than contemporary battleships, though at 28 knots were slower than battlecruisers. At up to 16,000 tons at full load, they were not treaty-compliant 10,000-ton cruisers. And although their displacement and scale of armor protection were that of a heavy cruiser, their 280 mm, 11 in, main armament was heavier than the 203 mm, 8 in, guns of other nations' heavy cruisers, and the latter 2 members of the class also had tall conning towers resembling battleships. The Panzerschiff were listed as ersatz replacements for retiring Reichsmarine coastal defense battleships, which added to their propaganda status in the Kriegsmarine as ersatz battleships. Within the Royal Navy, only battlecruisers HMS Hood, Repulse, and Renown were capable of both outrunning and outgunning the Panzerschiff. They were seen in the 1930s as a new and serious threat by both Britain and France. While the Kriegsmarine reclassified them as heavy cruisers in 1940, Deutschland-class ships continued to be called pocket battleships in the popular press. Large cruiser. The American Alaska class represented the supersized cruiser design. Due to the German pocket battleships, the Scharnhorst class, and rumored Japanese super cruisers, all of which carried guns larger than the standard heavy cruiser's 8-inch size dictated by naval treaty limitations, the Alaskas were intended to be cruiser killers. While superficially appearing similar to a battleship/battlecruiser and mounting 3 triple turrets of 12-inch guns, their actual protection scheme and design resembled a scaled-up heavy cruiser design. Their hull classification symbol of CB, cruiser, big, reflected this. Anti-aircraft cruisers. The development of the anti-aircraft cruiser began in 1935 when the Royal Navy rearmed HMS Coventry and HMS Curlew. Torpedo tubes and 6-inch, 152 mm, low-angle guns were removed from these World War I light cruisers and replaced by 10 4-inch, 102 mm, high-angle guns with appropriate fire control equipment to provide larger warships with protection against high-altitude bombers. A tactical shortcoming was recognized after completing 6 additional conversions of C-class cruisers. Having sacrificed anti-ship weapons for anti-aircraft armament, the converted anti-aircraft cruisers might need protection themselves against surface units. New construction was undertaken to create cruisers of similar speed and displacement with dual-purpose guns. Dual-purpose guns offered good anti-aircraft protection with anti-surface capability for the traditional light cruiser role of defending capital ships from destroyers. The first purpose-built anti-aircraft cruiser was the British Dido class, completed in 1940–42. The U.S. Navy Atlanta-class anti-aircraft cruisers, CLAA, were designed to match the capabilities of the Royal Navy. Both Dido and Atlanta initially carried torpedo tubes. The Atlantas at least were originally designed as destroyer leaders, were originally designated CL, and did not receive the CLAA designation until 1949. The quick-firing dual-purpose gun anti-aircraft cruiser concept was embraced in several designs completed too late to see combat, including USS Worcester and USS Roanoke completed in 1948 and 1949, 2 TRE Cronor-class cruisers completed in 1947, 2 de Zeven Provincienne-class cruisers completed in 1953, de Grasse and Colbert completed in 1955 and 1959, and HMS Tiger, HMS Lion, and HMS Blake completed between 1959 and 1961. Most post-World War II cruisers were tasked with air defense roles. In the early 1950s, advances in aviation technology forced the move from anti-aircraft artillery to anti-aircraft missiles. Therefore, most cruisers of today are equipped with surface-to-air missiles as their main armament. The modern equivalent of the anti-aircraft cruiser is the guided missile cruiser, CAG/CLG/CG/CGN. World War II. Cruisers participated in a number of surface engagements in the early part of World War II, along with escorting carrier and battleship groups throughout the war. In the later part of the war, Allied cruisers primarily provided anti-aircraft (AA) escort for carrier groups and performed shore bombardment. Japanese cruisers similarly escorted carrier and battleship groups in the later part of the war, notably in the disastrous Battle of the Philippine Sea and Battle of Leyte Gulf. In 1937–41 the Japanese, having withdrawn from all naval treaties, upgraded or completed the Megami and Tone classes as heavy cruisers by replacing their 6.1 in, 155 mm, triple turrets with 8 in, 203 mm, twin turrets. Torpedo refits were also made to most heavy cruisers, resulting in up to 16 24 in, 610 mm, tubes per ship, plus a set of reloads. In 1941 the 1920s light cruisers I and Kitakami were converted to torpedo cruisers with 4 5.5 in, 140 mm, guns and 40 24 in, 610 mm, torpedo tubes. In 1944 Kitakami was further converted to carry up to 8 Kaiten suicide human torpedoes in place of ordinary torpedoes. 1939 to Pearl Harbor. In December 1939, 3 British cruisers engaged the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, which was on a commerce raiding mission, in the Battle of the River Plate. The Graf Spee then took refuge in neutral Montevideo, Uruguay. By broadcasting messages indicating capital ships were in the area, the British caused the Graf Spee's captain to think he faced a hopeless situation while low on ammunition and order his ship scuttled. On June 8, 1940 the German capital ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, classed as battleships but with large cruiser armament, sank the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious with gunfire. From October 1940 through March 1941 the German heavy cruiser, also known as pocket battleship, see above, Admiral Scheer conducted a successful commerce raiding voyage in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. On May 27, 1941, HMS Dorsetshire attempted to finish off the German battleship Bismarck with torpedoes, probably causing the Germans to scuttle the ship. Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, previously sank the battlecruiser HMS Hood and damaged the battleship HMS Prince of Wales with gunfire in the Battle of the Denmark Strait. On November 19, 1941 HMAS Sydney sank in a mutually fatal engagement with the German raider Cormoran in the Indian Ocean near Western Australia. Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean operations 1942–1944. 23 British cruisers were lost to enemy action, mostly to air attack and submarines, in operations in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. 16 of these losses were in the Mediterranean. The British included cruisers and anti-aircraft cruisers among convoy escorts in the Mediterranean and to northern Russia due to the threat of surface and air attack. Almost all cruisers in World War II were vulnerable to submarine attack due to a lack of anti-submarine sonar and weapons. Also, until 1943–44 the light anti-aircraft armament of most cruisers was weak. In July 1942 an attempt to intercept convoy PQ-17 with surface ships, including the heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer, failed due to multiple German warships grounding, but air and submarine attacks sank 2/3 of the convoy ships. In August 1942 Admiral Scheer conducted Operation Wonderland, a solo raid into northern Russia's Kara Sea. She bombarded Dixon Island but otherwise had little success. On December 31, 1942 the Battle of the Barents Sea was fought, a rare action for a Murmansk run because it involved cruisers on both sides. 4 British destroyers and 5 other vessels were escorting convoy JW51B from the UK to the Murmansk area. Another British force of 2 cruisers, HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, and 2 destroyers were in the area. 2 heavy cruisers, one the pocket battleship Lutzow, accompanied by 6 destroyers, attempted to intercept the convoy near North Cape after it was spotted by a U-boat. Although the Germans sank a British destroyer and a minesweeper, also damaging another destroyer, they failed to damage any of the convoy's merchant ships. A German destroyer was lost and a heavy cruiser damaged. Both sides withdrew from the action for fear of the other side's torpedoes. On December 26, 1943, the German capital ship Scharnhorst was sunk while attempting to intercept a convoy in the Battle of the North Cape. The British force that sank her was led by Vice Admiral Bruce Fraser in the battleship HMS Duke of York, accompanied by 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers. One of the cruisers was the preserved HMS Belfast. Scharnhorst's sister Gneisenau, damaged by a mine and a submerged wreck in the Channel of February 13, 1942 and repaired, was further damaged by a British air attack on February 27, 1942. She began a conversion process to mount 6 38 cm, 15 in, guns instead of 9 28 cm, 11 in, guns, but in early 1943 Hitler, angered by the recent failure at the Battle of the Barents Sea, ordered her disarmed and her armament used as coast defense weapons. 1 28 cm triple turret survives near Trondheim, Norway. Pearl Harbor through Dutch East Indies campaign. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 brought the United States into the war, but with 8 battleships sunk or damaged by air attack. On December 10, 1941, HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk by land-based torpedo bombers northeast of Singapore. It was now clear that surface ships could not operate near enemy aircraft in daylight without air cover. Most surface actions of 1942–43 were fought at night as a result. Generally, both sides avoided risking their battleships until the desperate Japanese attack at Leyte Gulf in 1944. 6 of the battleships from Pearl Harbor were eventually returned to service, but no U.S. battleships engaged Japanese surface units at sea until the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, and not thereafter until the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944. USS North Carolina, BB-55, was on hand for the initial landings at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, and escorted carriers in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons later that month. However, on September 15 she was torpedoed while escorting a carrier group and had to return to the U.S. for repairs. Generally, the Japanese held their capital ships out of all surface actions in the 1941–42 campaigns, or they failed to close with the enemy. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 was the sole exception. The 4 Kong-class ships performed shore bombardment in Malaya, Singapore, and Guadalcanal and escorted the raid on Ceylon and other carrier forces in 1941–42. Japanese capital ships also participated ineffectively, due to not being engaged, in the Battle of Midway and the simultaneous Aleutian diversion. In both cases they were in battleship groups well to the rear of the carrier groups. Sources state that Yamato sat out the entire Guadalcanal campaign due to lack of high-explosive bombardment shells, PO.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.